Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Today we're hosting a podcast interview with members of the faculty from the School of Arts and Sciences here at the University of St. Thomas. We have members of the theology and philosophy faculty and also political science to discuss Pope Francis's most recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, and we're going to be discussing this for about the next 30 minutes. So thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to give our panelists a chance to say a bit about themselves. We have three members of our faculty here. Dr. Christopher Wolf is professor of political science here at the university. Dr. Tom Harmon, who's also a professor in theology, and Dr. John Hittinger, who's the director of the St. John Paul II Institute and a professor of philosophy. So we're happy to have all three of them here today. Before we dive into the encyclical, though, I'd like for each of them to say a bit about themselves and the work that they do here, their teaching and their research. Professor Wolf, would you like to begin?
Sure. And George, I want to say welcome to the University of St. Thomas. We're glad to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And yeah, so I am relatively new to the university as well. I have been at University of St. Thomas for 2 years now. Prior to that, I was teaching at the University of Dallas and at some community colleges. And I went to graduate school in California at Claremont Graduate University. And yeah, so what I mainly teach here are classes on the Constitution, the American Constitution, and also political philosophy. And something I've written recently is an article called "When is it prudent to polarize?" And so it's an article going to be for a journal called Perspectives on Political Science, and it's getting into that issue of polarization, which is very prominent in our politics today. And it kind of brings in some of my interests in the Constitution and also political philosophy and deliberation. And in some ways, I think it connects somewhat with what Pope Francis' discussion is here about brotherhood.
Great. Sounds good. Thank you. And thanks again for joining us. Professor Harmon?
Yeah, I've been at the University of St. Thomas since 2011. My teaching and scholarship is, my teaching in the department is largely in the core. I teach the core scripture class for the most part, although occasionally I teach our teachings of the Catholic Church class, the class on doctrine. And on the upper division level, I teach a variety of fun things. For our graduate program, I teach patristics. And most of my research is really about St. Augustine, specifically St. Augustine's dialogue with classical political philosophy. But I've written here and there on Catholic social teaching, on Catholicism and literature, and a variety of other things, Thomas Aquinas on the sacraments. So I'm sort of a theological polymath, I guess. Let's see, about me personally, I live in Sugar Land, Texas, and I live here with my wife and my 5 kids.
That's great. Great. Thanks again for joining us. Professor Hittinger.
Yes, thank you, George. I'm now starting my 15th year at the University of St. Thomas. I've previously been a civilian professor at the U.S. Air Force Academy, and I've taught at Sacred Heart Seminary, among other places. My specialty in philosophy is political philosophy. I've written on John Locke, Jacques Maritain, but recently I've started this new John Paul II Institute. And I have published a couple articles recently, one on John Paul II on immigration and another on Aquinas and Maritain on property, both of which loom pretty large in this document. So I am interested in starting to explore it. It's a huge document, but we can start to make some inroads.
Sure. Well, thank you. And thank you for joining us. Yeah, this document is a challenging document and a call to universal brotherhood. And it's the question about what are the sources of that brotherhood? What should it look like in actuality at the personal level, at the granular level? What should it look like at the political level? What should it look like at the international level? And then how do we get there? These are all questions among many other questions that are raised. And so we're going to be able to touch on a few of these, I think, in this conversation. But we're interested particularly in points of continuity, the ways in which the teaching of this document relates to past teaching. How do we read this with a hermeneutic of continuity? And then also, what are areas in which, if Pope Francis were to drop by UST tomorrow and we had a chance to have lunch with him and ask him some questions, what might we ask him, right? So what are some of these obvious points of continuity, but then what are some of the questions that this document raises that perhaps can be discussed and clarified in the future? So Professor Hittinger, would you like to start? I know there are all these things here about private property.
Yeah, well, I have in front of me John Paul II's Redemptor Hominis, his first encyclical, and he raises the issue of social love. He asks in a rhetorical way, he says, in our world, it's the question of progress, which actually goes back to Paul VI, that progress has a two-face, it's ambivalent. And he asks, in our world today, does good prevail over evil? In men and among men, is there a growth of social love, of respect for the rights of others? Or on the contrary, is there an increase in degrees of selfishness, exaggerated nationalism, instead of authentic love of country, and the propensity to dominate others beyond the limits of one's rights? I think social love is an interesting category. I know Dr. Harmon can fill us in more. Augustine is great on this topic, but I think it is somewhat neglected when we focus only on rights or political forms. So I credit John Paul II with keeping in his eye this question of social love, and it has to radiate out, obviously, beyond nations, beyond self-interest. But you get into those details, the devil's in the detail, as they say, as you mentioned, George. Well, what does this mean for our proper ordering of life? But I think it's timely for Francis to ask about social love. And I think John Paul II's question still stands. It's not very strong in this world. And what we can do to magnify it, participate in it, have it radiate throughout the church and society is a central task of our time.
Yes, absolutely. Hey, Professor Harmon, you want to jump in and respond?
Sure. Yeah, John's right. Social love is, I think, one of the keys to the document. But in order to understand what he's going to say about social love, I think we first have to talk a little bit about the rhetoric of the document. This is an encyclical. It's addressed to all people of goodwill in the whole world. And that conditions what he is going to say and what he really can say also. And I think that that also sheds light on what he emphasizes and what he doesn't in the document. And so, yeah, what he wants to get at is this universal fraternity. And he talks about many, many ways in which fraternity is operative in human beings or can be operative in human beings. He talks about lots of obstacles to human fraternity. But for the Catholic reader of this document, it's interesting. You have to wait until paragraph, I think it's 272, before you get Pope Francis's opinion that, or his teaching that it's not possible for human reason to establish the kind of fraternity he's talking about. Okay, so there must be something from grace, really, that is responsible for, in fact, establishing human fraternity. But that's not something that you'd pick up on immediately through the first 180 pages or so of this sprawling document. So I do think that one of the challenges people are going to have with this document is trying to piece it together into a unity. And I think focusing on what he's in fact trying to accomplish, which is the goal of a rhetorical analysis, is probably the best way to start. That actually might be a good place to segue for the moment, because I know my colleague, Dr. Wolf, is pretty good at that sort of thing.
Shall I?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Thank you. Well, yes, I would reiterate two things that Tom just said. One is that whenever reading an encyclical, we should look at who it's addressed to. It is addressed to all men of goodwill. And if we look at the end of the document, there is two prayers. One prayer it's called a prayer to the Creator, and the second prayer is called an ecumenical Christian prayer. And so I take it that means that, you know, Christians of other denominations would be saying this prayer as well as Catholics. And so in a way, he's kind of, I think Pope Francis is modeling brotherhood in who he's talking to, and offering to join him in prayer. And that the point that the second point I want to bring up that Tom just made is that it really is important whether this is a theological virtue we're talking about. If you'll remember, Martin Luther King Jr. would talk about, you know, that we are all God's children and that's what makes us brothers. You know, we're not, you know, without God there, we wouldn't really be brothers. But because we are God's children, we actually, you know, we are all brothers as a result of that. And that is said in this document in the section that Tom just mentioned, 261. But Tom is saying it's kind of brought up a little bit later. And so you have to keep an eye out for that. And that should probably be a part of this that we emphasize.
Chris, if I could jump in on that as well, since I would also say, correct me if I'm wrong, that the critique of totalitarianism comes at the end in that same section. In other words, there's a constant barrage against individualism. But, you know, most papal social teachings, going back to Leo XIII, carefully modulate the critique of individualism or liberalism with socialism. Again, am I missing something? Would it be fair to say that it's sort of a full bore on individualism? And then at the very end, he sort of pulls back and mentions totalitarianism. I think that's certainly a different rhetoric from John Paul II. Actually, he quotes John Paul II on totalitarianism at the end. But I would say that raises the rhetorical question to, yeah, are there some things that just leave a certain confusion if you don't get to the end, such as that, while critique of private property could be one, but there are others as well.
Right. Right. So this question of totalitarianism and the basis of it, I always know undergraduates are struck by the idea that the Berlin Wall fell, according to John Paul II. All of those systems fell because they were built on a lie about the human person.
Yes.
Right? The idea that the truth of the human person has to be at the basis of any political order, but this does seem to come in toward the end.
Yes, about conscience. Of course, John Paul II's claim that the Soviet Union fell, there was a revolution of conscience in Poland.
Right.
Now, I think the appeal to conscience is throughout, but I wonder if I may just launch out a minute on that private property question.
Sure,
so
by all means.
Is limited, but look,
Right.
see, private property, when he first starts to mention it, it's around number 118 to 120. It's somewhat brief, but it's an old teaching going back to Aristotle that the prudent position is private property, with there being a cultivation of common use. That's sort of the formula we've used. And there are various arguments for private property. I mean, one is just that it's better cared for, but I just get confused with the Pope's speaking here that private property is trumped by this, whoops, wrong word. Let's just say you need to put the universal destination of goods as the primary thing, and it's only a mere secondary. Well, look, again, those are intention that the world's goods belong to everybody. And yes, that's prior to private property. And in a certain sense. But I think this makes it sound like any appeal to private property must immediately be held in suspicion. But I would say private property itself is to be distinguished from publicly owned property. Private property is social. I think that's what he fails to mention here, that private property means the worker having tools, the parents having a house, the parents having clothes for children, the church having its own building, publishers and universities having their own printing presses, not run by the public sphere, which is what totalitarianism does. So again, I think he sort of lunges too quickly on this business of private property. What do you think, Tom or Chris, on that one?
I agree with you. I think, to go back, John, to your initial foray, you're absolutely right to point out that in prior Catholic social teaching documents, you have this modulation, this balancing between individualism and collectivism. And for much of the tradition of Catholic social teaching, the emphasis was really on resisting collectivization.
Yes.
So the condemnations of socialism and atheistic communism were probably much more prominent than condemnations of individualism. So that's definitely shifted. Now, there may be historical reasons for that. It's been 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there may be a re-examination going on in the Vatican of what the greater threat is at the moment. But you're also right, I think, John, to mention that the relationship between the right to private property and what he calls the universal destination of goods is, I think, correctly stated. But he does call it a secondary natural right, which is a term I haven't heard before, actually. And if he were here, I'd like to ask him what he means by that. But I've heard of the primary and secondary principles of natural law, but not necessarily of natural right. There is actually a question that I have also about the phrasing, because he actually says in the document that there's nowhere in Catholic social teaching that the right to private property has been called inviolable. But actually, that word inviolable is exactly the word that Leo XIII uses in Rerum Novarum to describe the right to private property. So there is this contradiction that we have to deal with now.
Interesting.
So that's definitely something that I would ask him. But John, I again, so I keep agreeing with you, John. Again, there is this tension between the private and the universal, or the particular and the universal, throughout the document. And he keeps insisting that what is privately held be used for the universal or the common good. But it's not clear what that relationship is that he wants to stake out.
Right.
I think that sort of tension or problematic is clearest when we start talking about the document's emphasis on the right to migration, for instance, because whereas he is quite comfortable talking about individual families defending their own, and even particular, especially indigenous cultures defending their traditions, he doesn't say very much about the right of a country or a nation to preserve its way of life, and what that preservation of the nation or the country's way of life does for the common or the universal good.
Yes, and that's what I was going to say. John Paul II did, well, just I want to say two things here. One is, I think Francis is in even more continuity with John Paul II on immigration, because this is the area where social love, I think, is most clearly lacking. That is a basic concern, or even addressing immigrants and the vile denunciation of those without documents that goes on in this country, I think, is very problematic for Christian conscience. But nevertheless, I think, again, to attack those nations that want to preserve identity is not the, I mean, it's not necessarily selfish. And that's where I'd say John Paul II says, when he talks about solidarity, it must be reciprocal. And he said those immigrants should not be passive, and they should not be destructive of the social practice or fabric of the nation they enter. Now, see, I'd like to see that kind of statement here, that immigrants should be welcome, but there needs to be a reciprocity, this acknowledgement that the culture, the laws, even the language of the host country are deserving of respect. So it can't just be a blanket opening of a border. There has to be an appreciation of some kind of organic relationship.
Two quick things. One is that the point that, Tom, that you brought up, that Pope Francis calls the right to private property a secondary natural right. I think that's it, you know, yeah, depending on what he means by that, I think that's actually precisely right, in an agreement with the tradition, from my perspective. If he sees it as a secondary precept of the natural law. And just because something is a secondary precept of the natural law doesn't mean it's like, oh, it's not that important. That's not what secondary precepts of the natural law mean. What it means is you have primary precepts, such as the right to preservation of life and duty to preserve life. That's a primary precept. From that primary precept, there are other natural laws, duties, and rights derived from that. And those are still natural law duties, still natural law rights, but they're just related to that, those bigger primary precepts. And that doesn't mean that don't worry about them or something like that. Second thing I wanted to mention about this was just that in my reading of many of the Catholic social teaching encyclicals on private property, sometimes I see an impression of capitalism and a view of private property that was a little bit outdated. Sometimes they would kind of see what they had in mind with capitalism and private property were these big landowners who had tons and tons of farmland, these aristocrats, and that they ought to, share some of the wealth taken from those big farmlands. I think you kind of see this in Populorum Progressio somewhat. That's not quite the condition of capitalism we're in right now, actually. And it almost never was in America. And so it's a little bit strange to read that sometimes in Catholic social teaching. But I would say a lot of this encyclical from Pope Francis is a more updated view of capitalism, which I'm glad to see.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think one of the major strengths of this document is Pope Francis sees that a kind of globalized capitalism is a predator. And so, I mean, you get some sort of very sunny language about globalization in, say, Gaudium et Spes, which is one of the documents of Vatican II. There's a more, I would say, realistic appreciation of both the benefits, but then also kind of drawbacks to globalization in this document. That, as a matter of fact, globalization has the potential to exploit across the globe as well. Especially, he emphasizes economic exploitation. And I do think that what he's trying to do with the oft repeated now church's desire for some kind of globalized political structure is a sort of counterbalance to what he sees as a baleful consequence of globalized capitalist exploitation. So I really appreciate that there's a more balanced approach toward globalization that this document takes.
Let's go to this issue of the right the right, say, to life and health care and related to immigrants. Now, he uses the phrase, there are rights prior to borders that transcend borders. That's actually right after private property, rights without borders.
Mhm.
Now, I think that is a correct formulation of the statement that rights do predate the political power. In other words, they're not granted by the state. But that means immigrants also have rights that exist prior to the state. Therefore, states have a duty to acknowledge the plight of immigrants and not ignore or not try to at least impede when they are legitimate. Now, the question of legitimacy is, again, the detail that needs to be worked out. But I do think there is an attitude Catholics need to counter in this country and maybe in others, that if they're at the border, that's their problem and not ours. No, it is our problem. It is our concern. And we have to address it. And, that problem falls on both parties. I don't think this is a partisan statement, that we have neglected the immigrant issue. Well, I'm told since 2001 that there was a good bill prior to 9/11 and it all fell apart. And since then, neither side has been serious about dealing with immigration. But to go back to my main point, rights are prior to the state, therefore they are above borders, or borders don't activate the right. What would you say, Tom or Chris?
Well, I would say that some of the people opposed to immigration reform have been big business and the globalists. It's actually quite interesting in terms of the political world on that exact issue, and so that makes sense to me.
So I'd say that this is another area of tension in the encyclical, though, that as Chris points out, one of the biggest boosters of open borders and mass migration are those global business concerns that Pope Francis is very worried about exploiting people. And it's interesting how he explains how that works. He says that what happens is that the globalized economic interests have an interest in destabilizing particular traditions. And I think the implication is that you make broader and easier markets that way. But I think actually one of the reasons why those globalized economic interests are also boosting mass migration and open borders is because that also destabilizes local traditions and makes for a flattened market that's easier for them to sell to and exploit. And so I do wonder if there's one part of the encyclical that isn't a little bit in tension with another part.
Now, he never calls for open borders. See, I would say that to identify rights without borders with open borders, I'm not saying you're doing that, but you jump to that. I would say they're not the same. We maintain a border, but still must acknowledge that those who come to the border are human beings, and we have to treat them with their dignity as persons. And I think the rhetoric in this country has not been very Christian.
That's true. And one notices also when Pope Francis addresses this question, he consistently speaks of what a healthy society looks like. So a healthy society is open to differences. A healthy society is open to diversity, is open to the gifts that new immigrants might bring. And I would say that for much of our history, the United States that's been a description of the United States. I'm not sure if that's a description of us now. So another question I would ask him if he were here is, what about an unhealthy society? Okay, what if your society is unhealthy and you can acknowledge that your society is unhealthy? What ought to be the attitude then toward the the immigrant? Is it the same, or is it different? Should you be trying to, before welcoming new people, should you be trying to become more healthy? In other words, because the things that we can give to the immigrant and the things that we're capable of appreciating and accepting are going to change based on whether or not we're healthy. And I can't speak for other countries, but at least my impression right now is that the United States is not at its healthiest point.
I don't see
Really?
that as a choice of an either or. I mean, I see what you're saying there, but immigration can't be put on hold. It still has to be taken up and done in an orderly, humane, and just way. But look, what can we return? I don't know how much time we've got left here, but your
Couple more
question of what's that?
We've got a couple more minutes.
But that the first point that Tom brought up about Pope Benedict being quoted, that reason alone can't do this. Again, I want to quote John Paul II, in which he said, Christians need to overcome any tendency to turn in on themselves and learn to discern in people of other cultures the handiwork of God. But he goes on to say, only genuine evangelical love is strong enough to help communities pass from mere tolerance to real respect. Only Christ's redeeming grace can turn us from egoism to altruism, from fear to openness, from rejection to solidarity. Now, that clearly means the first order of business needs to be conversion and evangelization of our culture. No question. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I think that's why he puts that quote in there at the toward the end of the document. Is that I don't know if you noticed, but he talks about the Tower of Babel earlier in the document, right?
Yes.
And he says that the unity that he wants us to try for is not the type of unity that you see with the Tower of Babel. Now, he doesn't explain a whole lot what that means. He just says, well, the unity they were trying for there is not the sort of unity that was willed by God. And he sort of drops it. But I think that the quote from Benedict that you're citing is meant to complete the thought, that the unity that's willed by God is primarily a unity that flows from charity, which is the grace of the Holy Spirit dwelling in the soul. And so how do you do that? Well, it's through evangelization.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting. We began our conversation with this observation that true fraternity, the very thing that Pope Francis is calling us to, begins with the fatherhood of God. Our fraternity is rooted in the fact that God loves us as human beings, and we're united in brotherhood that emerges from that source of love. And that's in fact where our dignity comes from, which in turn our rights flow from, which we then treated in discussions about private property and immigration. And then I think where we're concluding is also very important, because in some ways it's come back around. At the very center of the problems that Pope Francis is diagnosing is a breaking of that communion between a father and his children. And that's the work of evangelization, that reconciliation. And in many ways, as you all have observed, because of who the audience is for this encyclical, he can't go into all the details about original sin and the consequences of sin and the way these things are worked out in society. But it's there at the end for those who make it that far and have ears to hear. So it's interesting. We come back to communion. We began there, and that's where we end. And that's ultimately, that reconciliation is going to be the source and the solution that I think Francis is calling for. So we could talk for another hour, but I don't think that's what we're supposed to do. So, I'm grateful for your time and your insights, and I've learned a great deal already on this, and look forward to revisiting this. I hope those who are listening will take the opportunity to spend some time with this encyclical and take it on the terms in which the Pope has presented it, something for all people of goodwill, and use it as an occasion to really examine how we live our lives in light of the gospel and in the light that God has for us. If you find yourself in the Houston area, we'd love for you to stop by UST and pay a visit and meet some of our faculty and take a tour of campus. This is a place where we cultivate the Catholic intellectual tradition and the life of faith together as a university community. So thank you all for joining in and listening on this conversation. And thank you, professors, for this conversation. I look forward to doing this again sometime soon.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
George.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Thank you. Take care. All right. Bye-bye.
The University of St. Thomas has now added some programs online, including a John Paul II Studies Master's and Certificate Program. Please visit the website to find the John Paul II Institute and see if you might pursue some of these questions we've just been talking about in John Paul II Studies. Thank you.